You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristen Dilley.
My name is Kristen Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristen Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
Welcome to another fun-filled episode of Mind Over Murder, recording on this Memorial Day. We hope everybody's having an excellent day.
Incredibly enthusiastic. Maybe it's because you have the day off?
Maybe it's because I have the day off from school. That's exactly what it could be. And I get to have burgers later, so yay.
Patriotic feelings abound. We had a parade here in our little town, and we paid our respects to our men and women in military uniform, both current and retired. It was really fun, and it occurred to me that listening to the band perform, who were wonderful, this is a high school band from our area. They also did something where they had two trumpet players play taps some distance. It's very stirring, actually.
Wow.
But I was thinking about something. One of the guys was fairly close to us, and I turned and we listened very respectfully. But I thought to myself, that's actually a high-pressure gig for a high school student.
Yeah, totally.
To play taps solo, and they do this echoey thing. It's really cool, but I was looking at this young guy who was playing, and he was quite good. I thought, this kid's probably 16 years old. And the whole town turns and looks, and he plays taps. And then the other young guy plays taps across the way. And it was very nicely done. But most of the time when I have seen someone perform, it's actually a somewhat more experienced player, typically a Marine Corps trumpet player. I've also heard that real trumpet players are in short supply. And so some of them actually are playing a device that doesn't require them to play it, but just push a button and it's actually recorded.
Oh, wow.
Which I find really disappointing.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. And I think we should take a moment here, because it is Memorial Day, to acknowledge your family's military service, particularly Kathy. I definitely am thinking of her today on Memorial Day, most especially.
Thank you. And I know there are a number of people in the families involved in the Colonial Parkway murders who've had women and men serve in our military. So our hats are off to all of you. And happy June. By the time you hear this, it will be Monday, June 5th.
Yes, it will be. And that does mean that some of the news in this episode of True Crime News Roundup is just the slightest bit dated, but we figured that you guys would still benefit from hearing our wealth of information and, in Bill's case, snarky commentary on everything that we're about to report on.
What are you're going to characterize my commentary as snarky?
You said prior to going on the air, you were going to make it snarky, but not sweary.
Yeah.
I figured we should throw it out there to everybody. Okay. We try very hard to be snarky, not sweary, but if you ever meet us off the air, we're pretty sweary folks.
My mom would not be proud of me for that.
No, mine wouldn't be either, actually.
Does your mom listen to the podcast? I know she's a fan.
No, my mom does not listen to the podcast. No one in my family does. Not even my boyfriend.
Wow.
No. All I have are my fans. I don't.
Oh, my.
I know. They're very supportive. They like that I do it, but no, they don't listen to it. No one else in my family has the true crime bug.
I understand.
Yeah, it's weird for them. My brother occasionally will have people who go up to him at his golf course in Miami and go, "Wait, is your sister the one who has the podcast?" And the first time he was like, "How is this even happening? Like, how big is your podcast?" I'm like, "It's not that big." And he's, "It must be, because people ask me about it." So that's cool. But he's also taken aback by it.
You did have 1 million downloads, Kristen Dilley, so somebody's listening and we appreciate it.
Yes, very much.
Have you explained to your brother how this thing called the World Wide Web does allow people all over the place in Miami and other countries, the whole nine, to listen to the podcast?
He knows. He's a little bit of a Luddite, but yes, he knows. He's familiar. I think he just has a hard time believing that there's anybody who might want to listen to what I have to say on any subject. But that's the younger brother in him going.
I, for one, am very interested in what you have to say. And thanks to everybody else for listening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely makes up for the fact that no one in my family listens to my pod.
She said without a trace of bitterness in her voice.
Nope, not at all. We're going to go ahead and jump into True Crime News Roundup. This is possibly Volume 5, maybe Volume 6.
It is, although I usually find that it's easier to say True Crime News Roundup, June 5th, 2023. And that way I'm not too worried about sequential numbering.
Yeah, that works better. We have a couple of interesting stories in the true crime space, and we wanted to highlight 3 in particular. So we're going to start off today with Joran van der Sloot, who is the lead suspect in the Natalee Holloway case. Joran van der Sloot couldn't ask for a nicer guy. He is going to be extradited to the United States from where he is currently incarcerated in Peru. He's going to be facing charges of extortion and wire fraud in the case of Natalee Holloway. For anyone who is unaware, Natalee Holloway was a teenager, 18 years old, who disappeared on May 30th, 2005, when she was on a graduation trip to Aruba. She was last seen in the company of Joran van der Sloot and 2 of his friends, after which she seemed to have dropped off the face of the earth.
And the charges stem then from extortion, not murder necessarily.
Yes, that's right. Now, Mr. van der Sloot has been serving a sentence of 28 years in prison in Peru already for a murder that he did demonstrably commit. And that is the strangulation murder of a woman named Stephanie Flores in his hotel room in Lima on May 30th, 2010, which is literally 5 years to the day after Natalee Holloway's disappearance.
Very strange.
Very strange. Those charges of extortion and fraud here in the United States come from his attempt in 2010 to sell information about the location of Natalee Holloway's remains to her mother at a price of $250,000.
This is where the snark comes in. This guy is such a classy guy. Not only is he suspected in the murder of Natalee Holloway, which is still unresolved, this sleazeball actually attempted to sell information about her whereabouts, her remains, to her mother for $250,000.
I'm going to read from some reporting from CNN here. Quote, the missing 18-year-old's mother, Beth Holloway, wired $15,000 to a bank account van der Sloot held in the Netherlands, and through an attorney gave him another $10,000 in person, stated the indictment against him. Quote, once he had the initial $25,000, van der Sloot showed Holloway's attorney, John Kelly, where Natalee Holloway's remains allegedly were hidden. However, the information turned out to be false, the indictment states. Continuing your thought about being a classy guy, Bill, he doesn't even give the correct information once the money has been given to him about her remains.
So the indictment seeks to require van der Sloot to forfeit the $25,100, including this $100 deposit that Beth Holloway initially transferred to him. He'd be required to give the money back. We still don't know where Natalee's remains can be found.
Very sadly, no. He had alleged initially that his father, Paul van der Sloot, the late Paul van der Sloot, I should add, he did die. He alleged that his father helped him to move Natalee Holloway's remains and that they were buried under a construction site. That, unfortunately, did turn out to be false. And so we have no known location for Natalee Holloway's remains at this time.
I still can't think that there is a glimmer of truth here somewhere, which is, I believe, as do many others, that van der Sloot and his 2 sleazeball associates probably raped and murdered Natalee and hid her remains. And the father may be involved, but obviously they didn't find her remains at the site he originally described.
The Natalee Holloway case has been particularly fraught with twists and turns. For anybody who's unfamiliar, the sequence of events unfolded like this. Joran van der Sloot and his 2, as you said, sleazeball associates, Deepak and Satish Kalpo, were the last people seen with Natalee Holloway in Aruba. She left a nightclub with them, and she had gone to Aruba, as we previously said, for a high school graduation trip. After she was seen leaving the nightclub with the 3 of them, she was never seen again. Vandersloot and the Kalpa brothers were arrested in 2005 in connection to her disappearance, but they ultimately had to be released due to insufficient evidence. 2 years later, in 2007, they were rearrested and charged for, quote, involvement in the voluntary manslaughter of Natalee Holloway or causing serious bodily harm to Natalee Holloway, resulting in her death. And that's according to the prosecutors in Aruba. It didn't stop there, though. A few weeks later, Vandersloot and the Kalpa brothers were released because there was, quote, a lack of direct evidence that Holloway died from a violent crime or that Vandersloot was involved in such a crime. So they've never really been able to hold him for anything with relation to her murder.
Yeah, it's very frustrating and sad. There's this stop-start aspect to this investigation.
Now, Joran Vandersloot has been in jail, as we stated at the top of the pod, since 2012. He was found guilty of the strangulation murder of a woman named Stephanie Ramirez Flores in his hotel room in 2010. He did confess to the crime. He recanted it later. A confession is a confession. He stated that he found Stephanie Flores going through his emails and killed her in a frenzy. And for that crime, he is serving a 28-year sentence. And in addition, he had 18 years tacked onto that sentence because he was trafficking cocaine from prison.
This guy just never stops.
In order to get him back to the United States to face these fraud charges and extortion charges, Peru agreed to what's called a request for temporary surrender of Vandersloot so that he can come over here to Alabama and he can stand trial for the extortion and fraud charges. I'm going to report out from the Peruvian news agency Andina. Peru has an extradition treaty with the U.S. and previously had agreed to extradite Vandersloot only after he finished serving the murder sentence, meaning U.S. officials would have had to wait until 2038. But he will be temporarily returned to the U.S. for trial, then returned to Peru to finish serving his sentence for the murder of Stephanie Flores. If convicted in federal court in Alabama, he'll be sent back to the U.S. in 2038 to serve up to 40 more years in an American prison.
There's something very appealing about him rotting in a Peruvian jail. It just somehow appeals to me because this guy is just the worst.
Ugh. Beth Holloway did release a statement to the press with regard to the extradition of Joran Vandersloot. I want to go ahead and read her remarks because they are very moving. Quote, in May 2005, my 18-year-old daughter, Natalee Holloway, left Birmingham for Aruba to attend her high school graduation trip and was never seen again. I was blessed to have had Natalee in my life for 18 years, and as of this month, I have been without her for exactly 18 years. She would be 36 years old now. It has been a very long and painful journey, but the persistence of many is going to pay off. Together, we are finally getting justice for Natalee.
Our friend Cheryl Mack McCollum, working with Nancy Grace and others, has covered this case quite extensively. As you said, Kristen, it is a case with a lot of twists and turns. I'm hopeful that at least they'll be able to charge Vandersloot with fraud and get this money back. They can claw these funds back. You can see how Mrs. Holloway might have been desperate enough to give money to this criminal in exchange for information about where her daughter's remains could be found. It's a heartbreaking case all the way around. And I know in reading about the case and watching some of the coverage that Mac and Nancy Grace and others have done, the authorities in Aruba have been less than stellar, shall we say, in terms of the resources and the amount of cooperation. They seemed more interested in threatening Mac and others with arrest because they dared to be in Aruba. And this is one of those situations. I'm not victim blaming in the least, but you need to think long and hard before you consider an international vacation, particularly I think with young people, and you know there's going to be alcohol and a good time is going to be had by a group of young people, that something like a situation where your daughter disappears while on vacation in Aruba, you can find yourself really struggling against laws and rules and even law enforcement who don't necessarily work in the same way they would here in the United States. And of course, Aruba wants to promote tourism, and they don't really want the black eye that would come with something like the Holloway case. It is what it is.
Exactly. I had just heard a couple of days ago, just idly scanning through the news, I saw that there was an American teenager who had fallen off his cruise ship in the Bahamas and was now considered missing, presumed dead. Just so sad all the way around. But that definitely brought to mind the Natalee Holloway case.
Let's look for more developments in that case, at least in terms of the fraud aspect of what has transpired.
The other story that we've been following so closely here on Mind Over Murder is that of Doomsday Mommy, Lori Vallow Daybell. And the hits just keep on coming for her. Lori Vallow Daybell was recently indicted in Arizona on charges that she conspired to kill her niece Melanie's ex-husband, Brandon Boudreau.
This is the case where you feel like you need a diagram to figure out all of the people that have been touched by this completely toxic, cult-driven couple. It just seems so many different people who loved and supported Lori Vallow and her evil cult-leading husband, Chad. So many of those people seem to have ended up dead. It's actually pretty shocking. And Brandon Boudreau is just one of the people on that list. So who was Brandon Boudreau?
Brandon Boudreau was the ex-husband of Lori's niece, Melanie. And Brandon Boudreau had been in the midst of divorce proceedings from his wife, Melanie, when in 2019, he was dropping his kids off at school. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, took a shot at him, like a literal shot from a gun. The bullet ripped through the driver's side door of his Tesla in Gilbert, Arizona. And very luckily, he managed to survive this attempted hit. There are several counts that were laid out against Lori Vallow with regard to this particular event. The indictment reads, quote, on or about October 2nd, 2019, with the intent to promote or aid the commission of an offense, Lori Vallow agreed with Alexander Cox that at least one of them or another would engage in conduct constituting the offense of first-degree premeditated murder. The state further alleges that the offense charged in this count is a dangerous felony because the offense involved the discharge, use, or threatening exhibition of a gun, a deadly weapon, or dangerous instrument, and or the intentional or knowing infliction of serious physical injury upon Brandon Boudreau.
And then the next charges indicate exactly what the pattern is here.
It's very interesting that this is going to be the second set of charges against her in Arizona. She is already facing a separate felony case, also in Gilbert, after a grand jury indicted her in 2021 on a charge of conspiring to kill her fourth husband, Charles Vallow. If you remember from our reporting and from our interview with John Glatt, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, shot and killed Charles Vallow, her fourth husband, on July 11th, 2019. He orchestrated this.
Alex Cox, who had a very unhealthy obsession, as we understand it, with his sister, effectively seems to be acting as a hitman here. Even though the indictment, it's regarding the first offense against Brandon Boudreau, covers a lot of different bases by indicating that either she or her brother Alex were going to kill the former brother-in-law. It seems that Alex is the guy that ends up actually implementing these attacks. And she's got him so wrapped around her finger that she's able to put her brother up to multiple murders and assaults. And then he, of course, conveniently ended up dead as well. The whole thing is just so bizarre. You couldn't write fiction this strange.
No, and if you did, people would say that's so highly weird and suspect that nobody would ever believe that. As we're all aware at this point, unless we've been living under a rock, she was found guilty in Idaho earlier this month of conspiring to kill and then actually killing her two youngest children, 7-year-old JJ and 16-year-old Tylee. She was also found guilty of conspiring to kill Tammy Daybell, her fifth husband, Chad Daybell's previous wife. The string of dead bodies.
And these poor kids, this somehow is the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire thing. To lose all of these adults is a terrible thing, but then these two kids, even her sister said, you could have given them to us and we would have taken care of them rather than murder them, hide their bodies, and head off to Hawaii with your new husband.
I feel particularly awful for Kay and Larry Woodcock, who have been here through the whole entire thing. They were quoted in the media as saying, we have 3 trials to go now. They've had to sit through Lori's trial, which I'm sure was deeply emotionally fraught for them. And then they do have 3 trials remaining with regard to this whole sequence of events. They've got Lori's trial for Charles Vallow's murder. They've got her trial for conspiracy to commit murder against Brandon Bedreau. And then they still have Chad Daybell's trial for the murder of JJ and Tylee. I can't imagine what that would do to people who have had to sit through this many trials and hear this many recountings of how evil and awful this woman is.
The prosecutors made the decision, which I completely understand, that they had to separate the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell, her new husband, number 5. It seems to perpetuate the pain, it would seem, for the surviving family members and for the community, but I don't see much way around it.
They were pointing out, in case we're still trying to work out timelines here, Lori cannot leave Idaho and be extradited to Arizona until she's sentenced for Tylee and JJ's murder, and that's not going to happen until later this year. Once the sentencing is done and wrapped up in Idaho, then she'll be extradited to Arizona, and then the whole process will begin again, and she'll have to go through the 2 trials there, and then I assume Chad Daybell's trial will occur a little bit later in the year as well.
So for those of us who are hoping to never see their faces again, I'm referring to Lori and Chad here when I say that, I think we're going to have to live with this for a while because this is going to be stretching out probably over the next several years.
Yeah, it sounds like it. We would remind our listeners that we did just cover Lori and Chad's trial in some depth on a couple of our True Crime News Roundups, but we also had an excellent interview with John Glatt, author of The Doomsday Mother, and we would highly encourage you to listen to that if you have not done so already. John had some amazing and interesting insights into this case.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
All right, next we're going to go ahead and get into another of the cases that seems to have permeated this whole entire year, and that is the continuing saga of Bryan Kohberger, who has now been both indicted and arraigned in the Idaho Four murders. Accused murderer Bryan Kohberger was indicted by a grand jury on Tuesday, May 16th for the November 2022 murders of the 4 University of Idaho students in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. That indictment paved the way for his arraignment on murder charges on Monday, May 22nd. I'm going to go ahead and read some reporting from NBC News. Quote, the indictment returned in Latah County against Bryan Kohberger, 28, says he did unlawfully enter a home in Moscow, Idaho, and then did willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, with premeditation, and with malice aforethought, kill and murder victims Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernadel, and Ethan Chapin. And that's according to reporting from NBC News. So a preliminary hearing on that case was originally scheduled for June. So we wouldn't even have this much, except for the fact that the prosecutors very unexpectedly decided that rather than wait for a preliminary hearing, they wanted to impanel a grand jury. The reason for impaneling a grand jury, in my understanding, is twofold. Number one, it allowed the state to avoid that week-long preliminary hearing. And it also got around the need to permit the defense counsel to cross-examine witnesses. If you'll remember a couple of weeks back, the surviving roommate from the house where those students lived had been expressing how much she did not want to be present at a preliminary hearing. And I'm wondering if maybe some of this was an attempt to save her from having to go through the trauma of appearing in front of a judge and being questioned on this. I'm wondering if that at least is part of this.
I think it is, and I also think from what we've read and in talking to experts about this case, this is a very complicated case. The FBI, the Idaho State Police, and other law enforcement agencies work together as a team to put this case together, but it's a very complicated case with multiple DNA sources, electronic surveillance, the use of cell phone tracking, and analysis of dozens of camera sources and trying to calculate Kohberger's movements, both in the weeks leading up to the murders as well as the night of the quadruple homicide. I think the prosecutors would like to push back the presentation of all of this material as far back as possible so that they can present the strongest possible case. And I think they did not have any interest in this surviving housemate from having to testify at what they regard as this early date. So I think they wanted to push everything back as far as possible so they can get Kohberger and his defense team with the strongest possible case. And they'd like to try to do it once and as effectively as possible.
That sounds about right to me. So after the grand jury returned an indictment, and I think it was to everybody's surprise that it went to the grand jury, that then meant that Kohberger could be arraigned on the murder and breaking and entering charges. And so on Monday, May 22nd, he was arraigned on those charges. Now, he didn't speak in court, and I thought this was interesting. When the judge makes that request, how do you plead? Bryan Kohberger didn't speak. His lawyer spoke for him and said, "Your Honor, we are standing silent." And so here's what that means from CNN here, quote, "The unconventional legal strategy, also known as standing mute, relies on an Idaho criminal rule, which requires a judge to then enter a not guilty plea on the defendant's behalf, effectively allowing him to avoid verbally committing to being guilty or not guilty."
I don't think it matters what Kohberger says in court. And even a number of attorneys said this is meaningless, grandstanding at best.
Yeah, CNN spoke to an attorney from Seattle named Ann Bramer, and she said, quote, "It doesn't matter what he says or doesn't say. Either way, he's on the record with a not guilty plea." The standing silent or the standing mute plea is unusual, but it's not unheard of. Nicholas Cruz, the gunman responsible for the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School massacre from 2018, also chose to stand silent at his particular court case. I spoke to a couple of different law professors and asked, okay, what is the benefit to doing this? As a defendant, what is the benefit to standing silent? So I'm going to quote from University of Idaho law professor Samuel Newton. "The defendant may want to avoid criticism that could come with a certain plea. A not guilty plea, for example, may spark public outrage that they are not taking responsibility for their alleged actions. Prosecutors and defense attorneys may also be negotiating behind the scenes, potentially discussing a plea agreement." Wondering about that. What do you think?
Idaho's a death penalty state. This series of murders is particularly heinous in that 4 young people were brutally murdered, it would appear, by an offender. And if Kohberger's found guilty, I think there's a very strong chance that he may be headed into a death penalty case. His attorneys will have a job to do, and I think one of their goals may be to try to keep him alive. They may be trying to head off a death penalty charge, and there may be some effort to plead down to something that would result in perhaps life imprisonment without parole, something like that. I don't know about all this standing silent stuff. He did actually speak at other points. He did answer a couple of questions I saw from watching the available video, but then when it comes to the place where you're actually asked, how do you plead, that's when he pulls this kind of odd stunt. And it didn't serve Nicholas Cruz down in Florida particularly well. And I don't think it's going to make one whit of difference in the Kohberger case. They've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he's responsible for these 4 homicides. His decision to plead not guilty effectively by saying nothing, I think it's essentially meaningless. I think there are times that Kohberger may act like he thinks he's the smartest person in the room. And he may think that, and it's possible he is, but I don't think he's going to get away with murder.
I do the fact that CNN actually said flat out in the reporting they took that into consideration. A quote from the Idaho law professor, Newton, did say, "It could simply be the defendant is being difficult and not wanting to cooperate." And Seattle lawyer Bramer followed that up by saying maybe he's just trying to be defiant or attempting to show he's the smartest guy in the courtroom. And she mentioned that he does have that background as a criminology student. And she said he knew enough about criminal studies that it would have an impact on him. If you're right, and if he's just pulling this, I'm the smartest guy in the room, no one's going to expect me to do this, I'm going to do it.
Attorney Bremner also noted, by the way, there's no insanity defense in the state of Idaho, so that is off the table. This is going to be interesting. Like these other cases, probably going to take a long time to get to resolution. And death penalty cases, if we go down that road, tend to be appealed and extremely long in duration, years and years, sometimes even decades.
I am wondering if he's going to plead out at some point or another. I'm wondering if there's a plea deal in the works behind the scenes. It's something that I've been wondering about from the beginning, just to get the death penalty off the table. I'm wondering if he's going to be willing to do that, but who knows? He's also said any number of times, though, that he's looking forward to proving his own innocence at his trial. So I think it could be also that he has enough of an ego that he wants to do the grandstanding of the trial.
All I can say is I'm rooting for the families of these victims, and our hearts go out to them. This whole thing just seems like such a shame. 4 very promising young people wiped out in an evening. And then the more we learn about Kohberger, the more of a creepster he seems to be. I think the picture that will ultimately be painted here is going to be one that is extremely disturbing.
I hope that he doesn't pull a Ted Bundy and decide to represent himself in court, because quite frankly, I wouldn't put it past him.
That'll go nowhere. He's still going to end up either spending the rest of his life in jail, in my opinion, or facing a firing squad. They've actually brought the firing squad back in Idaho, which seems a little archaic to me, but who am I?
Bryan Kohberger's case is set to go to trial on October 2nd of this year, and that's expected to be about 6 weeks in length. So expect every podcast that you listen to around that time to start doing reporting on the Idaho Four again. And of course, we will be doing our reporting on that as well.
We also wanted to mention some other events that are coming up where if you are interested in learning more about true crime and maybe meeting us face to face, there'll be a couple of opportunities coming up. We're going to be attending the True Crime Podcast and Paranormal Festival, which is a mouthful. I'm a fan of the paranormal. I'm not sure that true crime and paranormal necessarily go together, but I don't know.
But that's where you get unsolved mysteries, though. That's the best part.
That is true. You're absolutely right. And I am a fan of Unsolved Mysteries. We were saddened to learn that the Unsolved Mysteries podcast was being discontinued, and our friend Steve French will be now using that masterful voice on lots of other projects.
Oh, I was so heartbroken.
The True Crime Podcast and Paranormal Festival is going to be in Austin, Texas, one of our favorite places. The dates are August 25th through the 27th. If you're able to get down that way, we would love to see you. It's going to be held at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, where I have spoken before. Beautiful town, lots to do and see, and this should be lots of fun. And we're actually going to be reporting out on the Phoenix Canal Killer case, as well as the Colonial Parkway murders in conjunction with other podcasters. It should be really fun.
I think it should be too.
We'll mix in some lighthearted moments to offset any of the heavy stuff that we cover. Julie Murray is going to be down there talking about ethics and true crime. She's one of our favorite people, and we were very happy to interview her a few months ago. So I think that's going to be a fantastic event. Following that, by about a month, we're going to be heading back to CrimeCon. The dates this year are September 22 through 24, and that's down in Orlando, Florida at the World Center Marriott. If you're a CrimeCon fan, if this is your first time going, or I think this is my 5th and your 4th, perhaps?
My 4th, yeah.
I think this is 5 times for me. There's only been 6 CrimeCons. We skipped the first year. CrimeCon should be lots of fun. That one is very large scale. I think there were about 5,000 people there last year in Las Vegas. It really was quite crazy. And we've applied to appear on Podcast Row again, so we'll let you know once we get confirmed on that. Those 2 events are both opportunities for us to meet you face to face, and we would love that, as well as for you to say hello and maybe get a chance to do a selfie or do some chat. It'll be fun regardless. So True Crime Podcast Festival, August 25th through the 27th in Austin, Texas, and CrimeCon, September 22 through 24 in Orlando.
Absolutely. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then we do have some Colonial Parkway murders specific events that are coming up in October in Virginia. We're not quite ready to release all the details on those yet, but please do look for information both on Mind Over Murder and Colonial Parkway Murders as we start developing more specific dates and times and details. We would love to be able to share all of these interesting things that are going on with you all. So please be on the lookout for those. We've got a busy summer and fall, don't we?
We sure do. And boy, even though our last week's podcast has only been out for a day, we're getting fantastic feedback on this latest episode we did with author Catherine Kate Miles on the impact of her book Trailed on the 1996 murder case of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. We absolutely love Kate. And of course, Kristen and Kate had a chance to meet face to face.
Yeah.
Just recently, and it was really a love fest. And I think Kate is an amazing writer and a very inspirational individual. And if you haven't had a chance to check that out, please do. The feedback so far, even though it's only been out for less than a day, is really amazingly positive. And I think that's to Kate's credit.
I also want to give a shout out. By the time when we are recording this, I will not have done this event yet, but by the time this podcast comes out, I will have. So we're in a little bit of a time warp here.
but it's like, are we in the space-time continuum now?
We're messed up. We're messed up in the space-time continuum. As of the time that we are recording this, I am looking forward to attending the Hope Without Boundaries 5K, which is being sponsored by the Black and Missing Foundation. That's in Washington, D.C. this coming up weekend. I am looking forward to going, to running, to meeting all of the folks from Black and Missing, and to being able to use what I love to do, which is running, to advocate for those people who are missing and murdered. And I think it's going to be an absolute blast. So by the time you guys hear this, I will have run it. But as of right now, when we're recording it, I have not.
So let's see. That means that the future is past, or the past is future, or the past is prologue.
It's a little weird, isn't it? But I have no doubt it's going to be a great event. The weather already looks like it's going to be very nice. And I've taken Friday off school. I'm going to look forward to being able to drive up there, see some of the museums, go do my race on Saturday, see some friends. I think it's going to be a very good time.
Why do I have the overwhelming urge to say something like, the future is now? And we're very excited that you're able to run and show support for the Black and Missing Foundation, in all seriousness. Fantastic organization doing great work. And you may recall that we interviewed Derica and Natalee Wilson, the fabulous duo who are sisters-in-law who founded the Black and Missing Foundation. And we are major fans of these two amazing women. And I'm so glad you're able to go and do this thing.
I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And this is definitely giving me ideas for things that we can do as a podcast to help promote our specific causes and cases. So starting to think, can we design our own 5K?
I like it.
I think we might.
I like it.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. If you like what we're doing, please make sure that you leave us a 5-star rating and review on any and all of your preferred podcast platforms. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristen Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.